So I am absolutely delighted to introduce our speakers who will inspire and enthuse you today. Our second speaker will be Indy Johar, co-founder and executive director of Dark Matter Labs. But first of all, I'm going to be introducing Katherine Trebeck, who is the Advocacy and Influencing Lead at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Thank you, Katherine, for coming to join us. I'm going to mute my microphone now and hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for being part of today. I'm going to try and share my screen if I can. Bear with me just a moment while I do what I can. Here we go.
And just a reminder then, if anybody wants to see that in focus, double click on it and it'll take
okay. So Sarah, just give me, can you see my slides now?
Yes, can see your slides.
Okay, I'll fire away. So thank you everyone for organising today's event. I've been here since this morning. I'm really loving the discussion and the enthusiasm, and it's just really exciting, particularly to see those rising stars. So I'm going to talk about the wellbeing economy, really what the concept is about. There's a lot of talk about it, and I was really heartened to hear the Cabinet Secretary set out her definition of what it is, because it aligns much more with ours than some of the other definitions we've seen floating around, and happy to come back to that in the Q&A. But I want to start with this quote that I often come back to in times like this, a revolutionary moment, which of course we are so deeply in, as we've heard often discussed this morning, is a time for revolutions, not for patching. And this was William Beveridge writing in the Beveridge Report that of course set the scene for the NHS and for the UK's welfare system. And I think we need to really hold those words in the front of our minds at the moment. It is no longer good enough just to patch and put sticking plasters on the old economic model, the one that we had going into Corona, because we had ample evidence of just how inadequate that was in terms of social justice, in terms of delivering what we need to protect the planet as well. And so in terms of really how do we go beyond patching, I think there's a mounting amount of support for this. We've heard it politically this morning. You heard it probably yesterday in the program for government. This is research that was done by our friends Positive Money back in May, so deep in the heart of the lockdown, and it surveyed people across the UK, and over 80% of people across the UK, I'm really proud to see a higher percentage in Scotland there, really thought that the priority for the UK as we emerge from the pandemic has to be prioritising first and foremost the health and well-being of UK citizens, not economic growth. And again, I think we need to remind ourselves of these sorts of opinion surveys, the sort of conversations people are having, to really build that ambition and the backing for the sort of changes we really need. And in terms of what do we need to go beyond patching, what is the extent of economic system change that's required? We've been talking for a long time about the need for a wellbeing economy. And at its most basic, it is about social justice on a healthy planet. It is about repurposing the economy so that it delivers first and foremost ecological and human well-being. It's about the purpose of the economy, so getting the measures right. It's about aligning the policy regime, taxes, incentives, regulation, infrastructure, how we do business, all those sorts of questions with that foremost goal of social justice on a healthy planet. I can go into a bit more detail later about what that's about if you want some more detail, but I know there's a lot of talk in Scotland already about a wellbeing economy, so I'm going to take it as given folks have got that sense, that goal of what a wellbeing economy is about. For us, though, what the really key central value is, it's about this sense of what makes us innately human. And you can sit down with people wherever they are in the world and have a conversation about what really matters to them, and you'll get very, very similar discussions. If you read any of the great texts about what development should be about, if you look at the brain scans, say, of neuroscientists that are telling us what makes us happy when the sort of stress level, stress hormone cortisol is lower in our bodies, when we're content, we're relaxed, you all put that together and you get a sense of what really matters to people. At the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we surveyed our members and pulled together the consensus of what the economy needs to deliver. And I'll race through that now. So firstly, it's about connection, that sense of belonging. It's reorientating our institutions so that they serve the common good. It's about participation, ensuring that citizens are rooted in their communities and that our economies are locally generated from the bottom up. It's about protecting and restoring and regenerating the natural world, not seeing nature as an input to the production process. It's about fairness, dignity and fairness in all its dimensions. That's horizontal and vertical inequalities and massively closing the gap between richest and poorest. And of course, it's about dignity as well, ensuring that everyone has enough to live on, ensuring that no one is left behind. And you pull those together and you get the core elements of what our economic system needs to deliver. And yet, the economy we had going into coronavirus crisis was so profoundly misaligned with all those values, all those principles of what we really require. And so how do we go about building an economy in service of those needs? Well, the question of growth is a big one. Is it about just growing the economy faster and faster and crossing our fingers that money will and wealth will trickle down to those who need it most, and assuming that that will not put undue pressure on the planet? Well, I think the evidence is mounting that we can no longer take that as a given. Just growing the economy is not good enough. So my suggestion is that we need to be fair weather friends of growth, really think about what sort of growth we need, in what circumstances, and generate it in the order to deliver higher order goals, rather than being its ever faithful followers and assuming that if we just grow the economy, then everything else will be fine, because we have got so much evidence that that isn't the case anymore. And so in terms of building a wellbeing economy, it's about getting the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. It's going back to beverage, saying it's not good enough just to rely on patching and tweaking and sort of undoing the damage that we created. And so some of the core principles of that are this really exciting idea of pre-distribution, saying we can do better than redistributing after we've allowed the gap between richest and poorest to open up. It's about the foundational economy, the community wealth building agenda, building from communities upward, and massively taking into account all that we would normally and previously dismiss as externalities in economic activity, environmental impact, social impact, through full cost accounting, and a suite of other measures below that. And so in terms of businesses and enterprises, what does this mean? Well, certainly not this. This is a headline that came out, you probably remember a few years ago, there was a mass shooting in Las Vegas in America. And what happened is that the share prices of guns and weapons companies went up. And to me, that's just one of the most profound examples of this extent of failure demand, how we're spending so much money because we're scared of each other. And we can, again, talk about other examples of that. And so we need to massively realign our businesses so that they're not ones that do well when we've had a catastrophe, when we've had a shooting, when we've failed communities, when people are struggling. That shouldn't be the basis of a good business model. Now, this chap here, some of you might be familiar with, this is Jack Welch, who used to be former CEO of General Electric. He's apparently the guy who coined the term shareholder value. Now, even Jack Welch is now saying that shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world. The idea that businesses are just set up to promote more and more money going upwards to shareholders and turn a blind eye to the damage that does to people and planet around them. So what we need to do is really embrace a different way of doing business. And we've got a document I'm going to share with you in a minute called the Wellbeing Economy Business Guide. And we've taken some of those 5 core dimensions of a wellbeing economy and thought about what does that mean for business. So in terms of connection, this is about designing corporate culture so that it aligns the purpose with collective values as opposed to just simply shareholder value. In terms of dignity, it's about thinking about what sort of business model will create the means for employees, customers, and other stakeholders to live in dignified lives. If we're thinking about fairness, again, it's about the business model, that key central fulcrum, the DNA of business, designing that in a way that distributes wealth more fairly. And in terms of nature, it's about using natural resources not as simply as an input to production through the create, make, waste linear economic model, but really thinking about how can we regenerate our natural systems. And finally, in terms of participation, it's about having values-based relationships with all stakeholders rather than just seeing shareholders as the primary audience for economic activity. And what's really exciting is that I think social enterprises, as the Cabinet Secretary was saying, are really walking this talk already. What they prove is that our old economic paradigm that said there is no alternative to business as usual is broken and is so flawed. What social enterprises demonstrate, and this is something we're constantly saying at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, is that there are thousands of alternatives. These are the pioneers of a different economic system. It's absolutely within our power to change the economic system, and that we all should reorientate our economies for human and ecological well-being. And the great thing is about social enterprises, not only in terms of the impact and the footprint and the hinterland of your own activities, you're so much more than the benefit you're delivering, what you might count in your annual reports, for example, or your social accounts. Social enterprises are already prefiguring what a different economic system looks like. And that is so profoundly important, because if we're going to have a chance at delivering economic system change, we need practices and pioneers that demonstrate the feasibility and the desirability of doing things differently. And so social enterprises have a much heightened significance above and beyond the provision that you're already doing. And I know this, if I mentioned earlier, the Business of Wellbeing, the guide to business as alternatives for business as usual. And what that sets out there is 7 dimensions of how businesses can really be part of creating a wellbeing economy. And I was thinking about this, so many social enterprises could tick every one of these 7 dimensions. Social enterprises are massively about redefining success. So that's not just about minimally providing for consumer demands, regulation. It's about serving people and environment. It's about rethinking ownership structures and governance so that we can delegate decision-making to where people are most affected. Social enterprise is also about collective leadership. They're about embracing a wide range of stakeholders. It's about innovating in products to deliver social environmental returns rather than just preserve the status quo. In terms of how social enterprises judge their success, it's not just about shareholder value or short-term profits, but it's about what's the social impact of our operations, and it's about collective learning. And again, I think social enterprises can tick every one of those boxes, hence why I'm so excited about this sector as an example of prefiguring what a wellbeing economy is about. Just finally, I want to share with you this post-it note that back in the old days where we'd go to conferences where we're all in the same room together. It was a meeting I was at in London many years ago, and a colleague just put this up on the wall, that large-scale change is difficult and it is only achieved through relationships, championships, legitimacy, patience, purpose, and passion. And that just speaks to me so much about the theory of change in terms of social enterprises creating a wellbeing economy. So I want to just really celebrate and endorse all that you are doing and encourage you to see yourselves not simply as doing amazing work in your communities through your businesses, but also to feel that you are part of the prehistory of a new economic system. And thank you for all of that work.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And you didn't even need your 1-minute timer, so well done. 10 points for you.
I hope I didn't go on longer, too long.
No, that was absolutely perfect. Thank you very much. Indy, if I could welcome you back to the stage, then that would be great. So I'm going to hand over to Indy, who, as I said, is Executive Director of Dark Matter Labs. If you've heard Indy speak before, I think it's going to be challenging and inspirational. So Indy, I will just I'll put my mic on mute and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you so much. Firstly, delighted to be here, and actually it's a pleasure to follow Katherine, because I'm going to be very hopefully reinforcing of everything that she said and she's doing, because I think that's a scale of the change I think that Katherine lays out is really critical. I'm going to open this up by really in the next 20 minutes to take us through what I think is kind of some of the structural changes we need to be thinking about. In a way, we need to acknowledge the scale of what we're in the middle of as well. COVID is not just a small blip. It is a significant impact at multiple levels, whether it's actually the scale of actual human impacts that's had around the world and in the UK and Scotland, to the economic impacts, which, the UK is facing what is likely to be the worst recession in 300 years, to the acceleration of large social inequalities. So I think we need to see it in the context of what's actually happening, which I'm sure has been part of the conversation today, but also looking at what the implications are. As you look further into this story, you start to recognize the psychological impacts the mental health challenges that are emerging, the economic injury, the burnout itself. So when you start to look at this over the larger scale, we know this is not just a kind of a trigger. It's a trigger that is fundamentally challenge deep vulnerabilities. I think this is where we really need to recognize that COVID, putting it into the kind of context that Katherine is describing, is almost like something that has exposed the vulnerabilities of the system that we were operating in. It exposed the inadequacies of our current institutional infrastructures. And in a way, it's exposed the fragility of our existing system. It's exposed the systemic injustices that were in play. It is actually driven, and I would argue that COVID heralds an age of long emergencies. And obviously, COVID is just the beginning of one of a series of risks that we're likely to see over the next 100 years as we start to move forward, or 10 years. If you look at the impacts of climate change that we're starting to already start to see manifest. And when you start to look at it from that thesis, we need to recognize COVID as a kind of trigger and driving a cascading risks throughout society. And I think it's really critical that we recognize now is not 2008, now is not 2014, now is 2020. And actually what we're seeing is some significant risks and unwinding of society that we've seen in a way that we've never imagined before. Whether it's the socialization of children who are staying at home, marriages, domestic violence, growing unemployment, all these things are coming together to accelerate actually social inequality. So I think it's worth recognizing this isn't a kind of a glorious road at this moment in time. We are in a very precarious situation. These risks manifest into transforming our cities and our places. Our cities, I think, are going to be massively transformed, and our places are going to be massively transformed over the next 10 years, just as a result of actually the kind of underlying infrastructures that we've been talking about have been made vulnerable. And you can see that all the way from where we're living, how we're consuming, how we're eating, how we're working, all these underlyings, which are kind of predicated on the idea of a central business district, predicated on the idea of you'd go into town and have certain things. I think we're going to start living different lives, and that has material significance. It's worth remembering, our vision of the city and the places we think about is, Notting Hill in the 1970s was a dump. Right? It was not the most prestigious place in the world. So we need to think about the world in a really open way in terms of actually recognizing the scale of change that's coming. And then it's worth thinking in the broader sense of actually, if this is an age of risks, and I would argue this is an age of risks and uncertainty, that I think, what does it mean to actually operate and live in an age of uncertainty? Often discount the impacts that we're having on future generations, as well as discounting what risk the future is bringing to us. Our relationship with risk has been fundamentally broken, and we are not really adequately managing some of those things. And you could argue the failure to deal with actually climate change is one of those manifest moments of our inability to deal with risks and our incapacity to deal with them. So if we look forward and you start to say, how are we going to start to deal with it? It's very clear that yes, we need resilience. Yes, we need anti-fragility, which I think is the capacity to absorb risk and grow. But we also need to go beyond. And I think, Katherine was really pointing some really good directions forward. We need to look at scaffolding the scale of the emergency and the transition. It is evidently clear in the 1980s, when we did large amounts of deindustrialization of the UK purposefully, we left generations of people behind. And I think that is exactly one of the risks we're going to see, as we're going to see major industries disappear over the next 5 years. So how do we start to think about that reality? How do we start to think about actually, the retail industry no longer being viable in many of its formats? The hotel and travel industry maybe no longer being the key wall store it has been, because actually not only is it just to do with COVID, it's all to do with actually climate change implications on actually travel and the long-term viability of that industry. So when we start to see these core things, the commercial office block no longer being the hotspot of work, actually the homestead and distribution of work becoming really much more of the future of work in that thesis, what does that do? How do we respond to those crises? And then we have to really look at the kind of cascading risks, preparing for the crises that are knowable. How do we transition our places? How do we deal with this inequality? And then it's really looking at statecraft. How do we operationalize in an age of unknowable risk, building the anti-fragility in the system? And there's lots of kind of ways of looking at it. We've seen lots of innovation from government and leaders around the world, the ability to be fast, optimally. Is that I think one of the things we need to bear in mind, the nature of the challenge is going to define typology and the way we have to think about it. And the scale is unprecedented. This is, I said this at the last Social Enterprise World Forum, is that actually the scale of the change that we're going to see over the next 10 years is of a unprecedented. It is outside the scope of what most of us have been imagining. And I think how do we gear the capacity to operationalize in that reality is really critical. How do we start to think about the kind of crisis of work, the crisis of collective psychological trauma? So you've got places like Sweden, which we're doing work with the Stockholm region, for example, which recognizes mental health and well-being as the foundational goal of the 21st century economy. Because what they recognize is that actually human capital in the 21st century is not about your physical fitness alone. It is about your total mental and physical fitness in a whole new thesis. And that is the basis of an economy which is focused on high performance cognitive work, care work, creativity, and craft work, because that is a kind of human additive value on an increasingly automated economy. So at the same time, we've got so many regressive forces undermining that foundational well-being that's required to deal with that, because most of our sources, as Katherine rightly pointed out, are extractive, are reductive, are reducing human capabilities in that format. How do we build the crisis of the social contract and trust? Again, to do this large-scale change is going to require the construction of legitimacy, and legitimacy at the scale that's been unprecedented. And then looking at our global supply chains, I think we're going to see massive work starting to happen about shortening those supply chains and making them more resilient systemically. And that again opens up really strategic opportunities to start to think about the future. Food security is going to be a big issue in the next year forward. You're already seeing governments looking at look at the price of rice, look at the price of certain goods. You're seeing food prices starting to become significant. So how do we start to think about that? These things are going to be critical. And there's hundreds of kind of different ways of looking at that. That's looking at the role of regenerative infrastructure, natural infrastructure. That's looking at the role of deep street retrofits. How do we start to make change possible at that scale? And the role of arts and culture. I think, and I'll point about this as I seek to close in a few minutes, is really the role of actually how do we support the cultural transition of us as a civilization is equally as critical. And so this has to be made manifest in the places of all where we live, and that's going to be critical in terms of being able to drive this. Now, operating in this world, I think, requires different modalities. When we're operating in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment, how do we make sense together? How do we build the capacity to be able to organize that? How do we talk about public interest in the 21st century? And is it global public interest? Is it local public interest? How do we talk about these relationships in different formats? How do we build the architecture for these things is vital. And there's, again, looking at that stuff, this requires also government to take different formats. How do governments look at 100-year budgets, 50-year budgets, 20-year budgets? Scotland's just announced a more long-term focused budget, but are we anywhere near close enough? Is public health a public intangible, a public asset? So is the health of a nation a key intangible asset of a nation? Well, if it is, it doesn't sit on the balance sheet of government. How do we start to rethink the accounting infrastructures of deep code issues that actually limit some of these things? The reason why we see a tree as a resource, as an economic resource, as something to be extracted, is because we don't understand its value in terms of actually its environmental value, its other social values, its flooding risk management models. So we see it as a liability in terms of cost of maintenance on a street and the cost of insurance. So these accounting structures are defining the public good and the social goods that we generate. So unless we go deep into the systems of actually kind of how we organize government, it's going to be difficult to make the scale of transitions we're talking about. So one of my big messages here is that the scale of change we're talking about requires a diagonal approach from government to business all the way through, and it is a structural change, not an insignificant one. It requires us to think about how we construct and build those capacities and how we build an agenda, which is both preventative. In order to build a preventative agenda, we have to be able to construct and understand future liabilities and risks. We don't make provisions in government. We don't make provisions for social costs and future social costs, and thereby we do not do prevention. How do we shift the task allocation. So where are these tasks? If we don't deal with them, where are they going to be? Where are the challenges going to be housed? How do we shift those tasks into more positive areas? How do we build a co-benefits economy? We aren't just investing in trees because we like, so we say we want the carbon sequestration value, but we also recognize trees, a community-owned forest can provide huge amounts of social benefits, and actually look at many social costs, associated social costs, as well as flooding risk. So intrinsically, how do we build an economy focused on the co-benefits of everything? A barber's that's not just a barber's in Camden called Lion Barbers is also providing mental health support. How do we build an economy that understands the multidimensionality of care is fundamental, actually transforming that? How do we obviously build a systems view again? We talk lots about that. And then how do we measure and operationalize this stuff? And this requires portfolios. This isn't about single stop solutions. This is about whole systems solutions that operate from government all the way down to actual kind of actual action on the ground. And this requires organizing across multiple actors. So change of this order is not about single organizations, but a whole movement, a movement of organizations driving that reality. But here I'm going to close in under 2 minutes. But I just wanted to sort of talk about. But this isn't enough, because what I would say is, and this is where I go back to really what the essence, as I understood it, what Katherine was saying, was that we are fundamentally in a transition, in a deep structural transition of our relationship with the world. The human relationship was constructed, our current view of the world was constructed about 300 to 400 years ago, where we understood the world through the idea that it was relatively infinite, and we saw things in isolation. We saw things in an infinite world, we made things objects. Increasingly, we're living in a small world where the interdependencies of everything are really visceral and viable. So the question is, how do we start to reorganize our relationship with nature so it's not one of resource, but actually of cohabitation? How do we reorganize relationship with the future in terms of actually not seeing it as a place to colonize the future and control it, but to be actual genuine interdependence with the future, both in terms of short and long term? How do we build a new relationship with things in terms of actually not necessarily about ownership? And there's a brilliant book by David Graeber called 5,000 Years of Dead, where you start to see thesis of ownership as one particular way of seeing the world. How do we start to build structurally a way of looking at the world through stewardship? And then how do we build human society and human development focus, which is really focused on enabling humans to be the agents of discovery and building the economic, social foundations, that allow and scaffold people to be agents of discovery, whether it's through craft, creativity, care, or actual high cognitive work. These 4 C's become actually the nature of the human transition. But these require a transformation in our relationship with ourselves, recognizing our interdependence with the world at every level, in time, in space, with things, with nature and ourselves. And it's a challenge. And it's only if we deal with these structural issues that I think we can start to resolve the scale of the wider issues. CO2 externalities are a function of how we see ourselves in the world. CO2 is only one part of the problem. It's a systemic issue which is born of how we constructed it. It was very powerful, our worldview, but it's come to an age which I think it's no longer actually supporting us, but is self-terminating to us as a civilization. And I think with that, we need to move forward. And that requires us to look at new models of health that go away from actually the thesis of health being one health, which is around environmental health, physical health, and mental health as being an integrated capacity. How do we build the development capacity? How do we think about long-term in a really radical way in terms of actually long-term models of financing, to long democracies, to deal with actually even how we organize institutions? How do we think about a natural assets economy into this future, into this a new relationship with that, which again is about treaties, and it's about different forms of relationship as opposed to contracts and ownership. What if a forest does own itself? And again, that's already happening in parts of the world. And how do we embrace the thesis of stewardship into a structural sense? So here I am. Redefining these relationships, things, humans, nature, future, is fundamental. But it requires us to look at looking at the things that are locking us in, looking at our perceptions of selves and how we construct our thesis of self. This is where the role of culture is really critical. It's also requiring how we organize ourselves. We talk fabulously well about organizations in social enterprises, but I don't think we lead in actually the innovation of pay, the innovation of employment rules. I think we have to be radically better if we're going to talk about an organization which isn't an employment-based organization, which isn't about quasi thesis of control, but really radical models of enablement. How do we deal with the deep code errors, the thesis of ownership, all these structural issues, the accounting issues I was mentioning? It's only if we look at this model through the sequence, I think we can start to free ourselves up. And the legacy lock-ins, the historic traumas are actually injustices. The carbon assets that we've got locked, are locking us in. We have to deal with this framework in terms of moving forward. So I think it's only at that scale of transformation that's possible. And I think we're starting to see many of these things manifest, whether it's from at many technological levels. So I would want to end there and then really come back to the group, because I think for me what's fascinating is that I think this is such a really critical moment. I think we have to make this large-scale transition in a really radical way, and I think we have no choice. The one thing I would say is that we're in a situation which is almost self-terminating for us as a civilization. This is no longer a choice. The rules and the mechanisms that we've made are terminating us as a civilization. And so the scale of change is of an unprecedented nature, and we have to organize for that. With that, I thank you, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you both. Absolutely outstanding contributions, and we've got so many questions. We've got about 20 minutes, but we're still not going to be able to fit them all in. So I'm just going to race straight on. First one is for you, Katherine, and it is essentially, we hear different definitions of wellbeing agenda. For some people it's just green, for some people it's something else. What are the challenges with those different definitions, and how do we move forward in a way that we all know what we're talking about?
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the question. And Indy, brilliant to hear you talk again. Always wonderful to listen to your thoughts. In terms of the question on definition, this is something really close to my heart at the moment, because the term wellbeing economy, let alone wellbeing, is becoming almost ubiquitous in Scottish government and policy chat at the moment. And perhaps inevitably, it's often being defined in quite a different way to the way we describe it. I think the way the Cabinet Secretary set it out this morning was pretty much bang on. I think the challenge, though, is some of the descriptions of a wellbeing economy, and I'll come back to wellbeing in a second, but some of the descriptions of a wellbeing economy confuse means and ends, which I think is so disappointing. I mean, Scotland is smarter than confusing the means and ends. And so often you'll see in some Scottish government documents, for example, the description of a wellbeing economy is about increasing sustainable economic growth. Well, that shouldn't be the goal. That should be, in some circumstances, the means to the ends of delivering social justice on a healthy planet. And so I think we've just got to really watch how we're describing what it is we need for what, and what are our ultimate goals. In terms of the word well-being, there's so many different conceptions of the term well-being, and to be honest, I get a little squeamish with them, because I think some of them lead to contrary prescriptions. But my colleagues tell me the beauty of the breadth of use of well-being is that it means it's an inclusive concept, that a lot of folks feel attached, and that they can see their own vision in the idea of well-being. I talk about, though, the two SCs of well-being. There's duality between the first SC, which is survival and coping, and this is often how it's understood and discussed, often say down in Westminster, the SC of wellbeing around survival and coping. And that leads to prescriptions that are individually orientated and about patching, helping people survive and cope with today's economic system. The other SC, where the wellbeing economy agenda is located, is system change, saying, yes, of course, we need to help people survive and cope today and tomorrow and next week, but it's not good enough just to do that. So what we also need to do is raise our gaze to the structures of the economy that are doing so much harm to people and planet. I'll stop there, though, Zara.
Honestly, we could just talk about this all day, and it's a shame we've got such wonderful other speakers coming in. I'm going to try and alternate the questions as much as I can. Indy, the next question is from Sarah, and it's: what would you say to a business leader who wants to know what they can do to change the way their business operates? And that could be a social enterprise, it could be an SME. Some of this seems really big and intractable. What would your practical advice be to a business leader who wants to contribute?
Yeah, the number one thing is I would suggest this is not a moral problem. I think stop seeing it as a moral, oh, I need to do good. I think this is about unlocking a whole new class of value in a way that we've just been taught badly to understand. So for me, is to stop seeing this as a kind of we've got to put 5% aside. We've got to do this. Actually, this is about unlocking a different relationship with the world, which I think will yield huge amounts of value in a way that's been underestimated. So every human in your organization is more powerful than any general artificial intelligence that's ever been built. Yet, actually, all management theory is constructed around the thesis of control. It's not actually constructed through a thesis of enabling. So even if you were to unlock the full collective intelligence of the whole capability of your organization, I think you've done massive amounts. So I think you can literally start. And I think, for me personally, I think the transition we're talking about is going to happen. The only question is how it happens and where it happens. And so my big thesis to kind of business leaders would be to see this as a radical transition as the Industrial Revolution was. Not to see this as a moral holdback. You can't do this, you can't do that. It's not a can't. It's a whole new scaffolding to a whole new future of value. And I think the underlying thesis is stop seeing your organization in boundaries. I think the same problem exists for corporates as it does for social enterprises, as it does for cooperatives, that we are all designed to think of ourselves as this definitive boundaries, in and out groups, what's inside the organization, what's outside the organization. In an interdependent world, that thesis of boundary-based organizing is actually more and more vulnerable. So you have to start to see yourself as a leader in a system. And you have to fundamentally organize yourself as a leader in the system. And your investment thesis is going to be as a leader in a system, not as an organization. And that's both a worldview change, but it's also an investment structure change. It's also understanding your risks differently. It's understanding your value chains differently. So I think this is it's a perspective, but it's also a structural perspective in terms of how we organize. And I think, whether it's, I could talk about food systems, I could talk about, there's going to be hundreds of transformations in every part of the world. So there's huge amounts of value that's going to be created. Look at the rise of vegan food groups, massive. Right, we're going to see massive transformation of value. So I would really encourage our entrepreneurial leaders to really start to think large, but not large in a single corporate sense, but in a system sense, and what your contributions can be in that scale.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We will go straight on to the next question because they just keep getting fired at me. This is for you, I think, Katherine, and it's from Jerry, who says that New Zealand has recently introduced its Wellbeing Budget 2020. Will other countries or regions follow this lead? And what measures could be in place to determine if wellbeing outcomes are being achieved?
Oh, great question. So it was last year when New Zealand brought in their wellbeing budget, which they touted as the world's first wellbeing budget. To be honest, I think that's a little bit unfair to Bhutan and so many other countries that are starting to do outcome and impact assessments in their budgets. What I think is most exciting about the wellbeing budget in New Zealand is the expectation that government departments will work together to deliver on shared goals. So for the element of the budget that was focused on the wellbeing agenda, they had 5 goals that included things like transition to a low carbon economy, addressing mental health, addressing child poverty, support for the Maori community in New Zealand, and moving to more sort of high-tech New Zealand economy. And so government departments had to team up and do joint budget bids. And I think that's a really good example of starting to break down this sort of reductionist subject by subject area, where, as you've just heard so powerfully from Indy, so many things are all connected and will deliver the best outcomes when we look for co-benefits across the system. And so if we're only looking at education and not understanding how that impacts with employment, or impacts even with how we support the environment, or if we're looking at social justice and not understanding the relevance of questions around, you know, criminal justice and so on, we won't understand those ripple effects and interlinkages. And so that initiative, expecting government departments to work together, I think it's really exciting. In terms of how it might move on, I think governments around the world are hopefully, some of them at least, starting to think more long term. I'm doing a project at the moment looking at what a wellbeing budget for Scotland might look like through the lens of children's first 1,001 days. So watch this space. I'll be working on that in the coming months and hopefully reporting on that early next year. If anyone has any ideas, I'd love to hear from you. But I think essentially one of the key tasks in this, or the key tricks to shift the alignment, is about setting a different goal for the budget than just sort of that annual expenditure and focusing on economic growth. There's a brilliant phrase that budgets are moral documents with numbers attached. And until we start really embracing their role as really an example of what our values are, what our intention is as a society, we will just see them as sort of downstream sticking plaster, the patching stuff that Beveridge was so rightly critical of.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Katherine. Indy, did you want to comment on that question, or I've got another one ready for you?
Well, I was just going to reinforce Catherine's point. I think the kind of the budgeting and how we understand the future is actually really critical, and I think there's a piece of work around how we think about long-termism in terms of those budgets, but also the impacts we generate on future citizens of Scotland. I think we have to become conscious of how we're foreshortening and limiting future Scottish citizens and their capabilities in our actions. And I think that requires a new form of accountability for those that are economic civic agents now, but also future economic civic agents. And I think it requires a new form of relationship in that. So I couldn't anything but endorse what Katherine was saying.
Okay, so the next question is addressed to you, Indy, but I think Katherine, you might have a take on it as well. It's from Sue, and it's about the relevance of a rural perspective, and if you've got any thoughts on what our rural communities can bring to this new way of thinking.
I mean, firstly, I would say that rural might. So there's two things. I think the rural-urban conversation is problematic because it sort of understands the world from a thesis of buildings and less buildings, rather than understanding the interdependence that we have with the rural context, whether it's our water systems or whether it's actually our food systems or whether it's our energy systems. Actually, there's a huge amount of interdependence, and I think we have to start to rebuild a conscious interdependence. Secondly, I think I would say we're going to see the foreshortening of global supply chains. We're doing a piece of work again in Sweden, looking at future food systems and how they actually deal with food systems risks, and they are looking to bring back a large-scale local food economy because they recognize that as a global risk, right? So we are going to see a new form of relationship being recast, whether that's food, energy. I think the rebuilding of the essentials is going to be critical. Thirdly, I think it's really important to start to talk about the rehabilitation of Scotland. Because I don't buy the thesis that was running up to COVID, where everyone's saying, yeah, all rural communities are diminishing and we're going to go. I think we'll go the other way increasingly. In a high-risk world, actually what we're going to see is the rehabilitation of towns. And I think what we have to talk about is, what does 21st century value look like when you start to rehabilitate Scotland and its towns in a really radical format? Because I think technology, as we're doing this all over, this event is geolocated in lots of people's homes and also all over the world. We're seeing a new type of behavior being built. And I think we're going to see a kind of new form of, and I think the biggest challenge will be our cities. I'll worry more about our cities than I would worry about our rural communities, because I think we can talk about a rehabilitation and rehabilitation of our rural landscape in a way that could be genuinely productive and genuinely open and progressive if we want it to be. So I would look at it from a different lens, and I think we're going to start to see that. I think our cities are very fragile and more vulnerable, actually.
Really
we'll see an exodus of people.
There was a programme on Radio 4 actually exactly about that and about the future of cities just quite recently. And there's lots of different perspectives. Some people seeing it as good, some people seeing it as bad, and some people sitting on the fence. Catherine, was there anything that you'd like to add about the rural, or will I move on to the next question?
No, far away. That was a great answer. So
okay. So the next question is from Laura, and it says, what you're talking about here, both of you, is a complete paradigm shift in a world view in terms of how we view each other and the world around us. And there will inevitably be tension between those who have made the paradigm shift and who want to, and those who are defending the previous paradigm. How do we manage that tension and facilitate dialogue? A great question. Who wants to jump in first?
I'm happy to start, Indy, but I'm keen to hear your reflections too. I mean, it is a really brilliant question. And I saw up in the chat, I can't remember who it was, and I hear this a lot, people talking about the economic system being broken. And it's a term I never use because I don't think the economy is broken. I mean, the one we had going into COVID. It's an economy that was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is sort of extract wealth upwards. And you see this idea of political capture. Donella Meadows has this lovely phrase of success to the successful, where those who are privileged and have great resources can quite literally design the rules of the game for their own benefit to protect and increase that wealth that they have. And so there are some very clear vested interests who won't want to hear about this sort of conversation, won't want to talk about or entertain the idea of the extent of economic system change that we need to go about if we're going to build a wellbeing economy, who won't want to talk about changes in power dynamics, who won't want to talk about different conversations around ownership structures, who won't want to talk about different ways even of doing democracy, where more people have a substantial, authentic, robust say in policy decisions that are emerging. And so that is one of the dilemmas. How I guess try to become hopeful in the face of that very, very serious barrier to this change is partly because of the growing numbers of people who are recognizing the need to change. And that opinion poll I showed at the very beginning is just one example. You hear it, especially if you're talking with people and through deliberative conversations, what people really reflect on, what most matters to them, what makes us innately human is really aligned with some of the core principles of what a wellbeing economy is setting out. So in a way, there's a pretty solid mandate there for what the extent of change that's required, which means it's a strategic conversation in terms of addressing the power of those vested interests, because there is, I think, huge amount of supports. We've got, in a way, the hearts and minds are there supporting different dimensions and to different degrees of this agenda. But I take that through to the strategic conversation. In a book I published last year with Jeremy Williams, this will completely show my age and my bad taste in music. We quote a Police song from the 1980s, and it was a song where Sting is singing, "I hope the Russians love their children too." And of course, that's in the Cold War context. But there is something about going up to that conversation about what makes us innately human. I don't think people who want to preserve the current system do it purely out of their own greed, or do it purely because they're bad people and they're ignoring the environment, or they're ignoring the social injustices that have been generated by the system. I think what we need to do is have the conversation around what sort of country do we need for your grandchildren. Start there. And then we can have the debate on the practicalities of it, but start with the values that people ultimately, I'm heartened by, do share. And that is easier said than done. And so I don't have a perfect answer to that. I'm not blind to how challenging that is, because I tell you what, when you try to change the system, it bites back. It absolutely bites back. And all of us on this call, a lot of people in the audience will have felt that. And so I'm not pretending by any means this is an easy task.
So spoke feminists everywhere and Black Lives Matter protesters and anyone who's trying to change anything that works for some people. Indy, you've got the answer, I'm sure. You can tell us.
Well, I don't know about sure, but I can look. I think it's a really important question, and I think unless we address it, it's not going to happen by just niceness. I think so. The reason why I say that is that if you look at the abolishment of slavery, right, the 1833, it wasn't just a conversation about let's all get together. It was also a conversation, and after 50 years of protest and challenge, right, by Quakers. The Quaker movement that really led that conversation, and protest by massive protest from actually Black African, but it was also to do with 25% of GDP being spent to actually abolish slavery. So we actually bought out the problem to resolve it. It also, South Africa didn't just transition, it had a massive Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you go back in history, there have been massive amounts of debt jubilees to actually create a level playing field. So if we talk about this transition, this isn't just going to be, me and Katherine by ourselves doing this. It's actually got to be a societal compact. And it is going to require large-scale writing off of assets, large-scale reconciliation and building of social contracts to a transition. So I just want to make that kind of thesis that I think it's really critical that we acknowledge exactly this. And it's also stuck in our language and our culture. So our words that we use, how we see the world, how we construct the other, our corporate systems. It's also, this is not just a problem of big things, it's also a problem, 80% of the English language now is nouns, not verbs. Right, so if you look at in Swabi language or any of the indigenous languages, many of them, they're entirely verb orientated. So the object worldview is constructed through our language, our cultures, how they manifest. And to really rebuild ourselves, we're going to have to invest in culture. We're going to have to invest in these great transitions and addressing these lock-ins at a structural level. And I think only then can we move forward. So I think it's a critical question. And I think this is why this transformation requires alliances between government, society, and enterprise in an integrated way.
Thank you so much to both of you. Absolutely mind-boggling, all the things that you've raised, and it feeds into our breakout sessions really well. As I mentioned before, we can't give you a round of applause apart from me, but I hope that the activity in the chat has made you realise just how engaged people have been and how grateful we are that you guys have made the time to come in. There's lots of questions we didn't get to ask, including one about diversity and inclusion and how we bring everybody with us. I will mention that in a minute because we've got that in a breakout session. So thank you to Indy, thank you to Katherine.